All right, welcome everybody to the second Chases lecture of 2025. My name is Mark Hersey. I am an associate professor in the history department where I direct the Center for the History of Agriculture, Science, and the Environment of the South, which is Chases. It is our great pleasure to have Megan Raby here today. Megan comes to us from the University of Texas where she's an associate professor. She is a historian of science and the environment. And we are delighted that she has made it over here. Her first book, American Tropics, The Caribbean Roots of Biodiversity Science, won the Pauley Prize, the Philip J. Pauley Prize from the History of Science Society, and became something of an instant classic. It has been cited a lot and repeatedly, and she's authored numerous articles as well. She also has significant editorial experience, including at the Journal of the History of Biology, is that right? The ISIS, and she's most importantly, obviously, on the editorial board of Environmental History, which she is a much valued member. She's here today to talk about her current book project, which centers on, and then I have a bunch of things scratched out, entomologist, biologist, and I settled on environmental writer, Marston Bates. So please join me in welcoming Megan to Mississippi State.
Thank you. I'm really, really happy to be here. I want to thank Mark for inviting me. The Chases program and lecture series just seems like a cool thing, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I also want to thank Pam Wasson and Jackie Perkins for your help in getting me here and making sure I'm in the right place at the right time, and also feeding me too much food while I'm here, and all of this. It's been great so far to visit Mississippi State, which in some ways, although I've never been here before, feels a bit familiar. There are so many people who I've known for so long, and now I'm going to make Matt feel that Alex, Matt, Mark, Matt goes back to grad school with me at UW-Madison, so we've known each other for a long time through a variety of ways: environmental history, history of science, and grad school. So I also do want to take a moment to give special thanks up front to the National Endowment for the Humanities, which supported significant writing time for this project during the 2024 year. I had a fellowship which allowed me really to make significant progress on this book. And as you may be aware, the NEH staff are facing unprecedented pressures, cuts, firings, pressures to resign, partisan political interference right now. And I think they deserve our support for all the support they've given to advance the humanities in our country since the NEH was established by Congress in 1965. And so I just wanted to take a moment to make that statement. Okay, so what comes today, what I'm going to share with you today is from my current book project, second book, which will be the first biography of the influential 20th century American biologist and environmental writer, Marston Bates. And I do not expect that most of you have necessarily heard of him before. So I'm happy, first of all, to get the chance to introduce him to you. I first became interested in Bates, what feels like a very long time ago at this point, while I was writing my dissertation, actually, and then first book, American Tropics. I'm going to just shamelessly plug my first book. And at first, he just seemed to keep popping up everywhere I looked as I was doing my research. He worked at all the stations that I talk about, pretty much all of them. He wrote about the tropics. And when I then read his work, I was really impressed by how different his perspectives seemed to be from comparable figures of his time, from other tropical biologists, for example. Here was a scientist who, in the 1920s through 1940s, had worked as an entomologist for the United Fruit Company and for the Rockefeller Foundation after that. Two of, I would say, the most powerful US corporate and philanthropic forces of the 20th century, institutions that really reshaped the environment around the world as well. Yet, in the latter half of his life, as a professor at the University of Michigan and as a public figure in the 1950s and 60s, he really became, I would say, a critic of the sort of neo-colonial international development efforts that he had, in a sense, once been a part of. And so I was intrigued. How had this happened? And the more that I then learned increasingly about the drama of his life story, as well as his actual work, I kind of was hooked. There was a bigger story here, I thought. So, although Bates was a prolific author and a pretty widely known public figure in his day, today I would say Bates is remembered mostly by an enthusiastic few, particularly among tropical ecologists, geographers, some historians of science education for that textbook that's up there on the screen, and of course, environmental historians as well. His book Forest and the Sea made its way to a list of books that environmental historians should not forget about, should read some years back in environmental history. And at its core, I would say Bates's wide-ranging work centered on the problem of humanity's place in nature. His books spanned an enormous array of topics: the tropics, population growth, life on a Pacific island, ecology, the nature-culture boundary, and human behavior. And he wrote a book, he edited a book that helped introduce general readers to Darwin's writings around the centennial of Darwin's Origin of Species. As lead author, as I kind of suggested earlier, of the BSCS's green version of its high school biology textbook, there were really millions of children who read his work without necessarily knowing it. And he also wasn't above putting out a few coffee table books as well. So, in fact, I know there's a bunch of grad students in the room, so I thought I'd share, when I was a PhD student and I was kind of interested in him on the side, it was interesting to me that, my three main committee members all knew who Bates was. They considered him to be an important and understudied figure, but they all knew him for different work, right? So my advisor, Greg Mittman, knew of Bates for his work uncovering the ecology of yellow fever in South America in the 1940s. Also on my committee, Lynn Neihart, who's a historian of biology, she knew him for his popular Nature of Natural History, which you might find on used bookstore shelves, if used bookstores are around anymore. And Bill Cronin thought of him for his role in the 1956 volume, Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth, which has been kind of couched in many environmental historians' writings as kind of an influence on environmental history and a precursor to the idea of the Anthropocene. So you might have come across him in any of these ways, right? He's been marginal kind of in a lot of different stories, but never at the center. But at the center of this wide-ranging work is this question of humanity's relationship to nature. And in working on this project for some years now, I've come to think that the questions he raised about how people can live on Earth with each other and with the natural world really are more crucial than ever. So I do think there's something worth revisiting in his actual writing, as well as the story you can tell by following him through his life. So again, in large part, my talk today is meant simply to introduce this fascinating figure, give you a preview of my in-progress book, which approaches Bates as both a participant and a critical observer of some of the major environmental transformations of the 20th century. And at the same time, as I think the talk title suggests, I'd like to take the opportunity to consider some key questions of methods at the intersection of biography and environmental history. Because, think about it. Biography, environmental history, they seem like very different fields, right? What could be more anthropocentric than biography, right? Environmental history focuses on nature. Biography focuses on the individual human. But I think there are some intersections, right? So after all, biographers in narrating lives always have to wrestle with the balance of the life and the times of the individual subject, right? The individual and their historical context. The problems of, you face the problems of how to place the spotlight on the actor versus when to kind of illuminate the stage in approaching a biography. And similar questions of methods are always there for really all historians, but environmental historians too, especially given the traditional role of the environment as a kind of stage that history takes part on, right? That happens on, right? So environmental historians are concerned with questions of how you bring nature to life while acknowledging that history is, necessarily anthropocentric, necessarily also always including humans. So how do we narrate the interplay of our human and non-human actors? Is it possible, I brought up the Anthropocene, is it possible to write about processes of global environmental change without losing the personal kind of ground level view? So I think those questions of narrative focus, scale, agency even, are all important questions for historians in general. And so I do hope that my talk will be interesting to you, even if you're not inherently interested in biography or even in environmental history or in Bates per se. So without further ado, let me go ahead and dive into Bates' life. I'm going to share 3 brief kind of examples or kind of snippets from his life, episodes per se, of his experience and participation in environmental change, and examine how these experiences in turn shaped his perspective. Before I then move on to, at the end, kind of discussing some more of these kind of methods, kinds of questions, and hopefully fostering some discussion. So the first episode will be his youth in Florida. The second will be his first job out of college with United Fruit Company in Central America. And then finally, I'll spend some time with him in Colombia, which was his last foreign post before he returned to the US and became more of a popular environmental writer. So Marston Bates was 9 years old when his parents decided to pack their motor car and move the family to South Florida in the fall of 1915. Bates later reflected that if they'd stayed in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the industrial city where he was born in 1906, he probably never would have become a naturalist. And here I think Bates's story intersects with the concerns of Chase's, right, with the history of agriculture, science, environment, and the American South, because Bates, while he's best known for his field research in the tropics, and his books were written when he was a professor at the University of Michigan, he did actually grow up in the South, in Florida, and he always identified as a Southerner. And I would argue his childhood and education in Florida in the 19-teens and 20s, in fact, really deeply shaped his outlook on the environment, on humans, and the course of his life and career. And so here he is. As an awkward only child, surrounded by a new and unfamiliar landscape, Marston became fascinated with the natural world. It was a world of wetlands, shorelines, estuaries, prairies, pine flatwoods. It was sparsely populated, but full of life. And at 14, he was gifted insect pins, and he developed a serious interest in butterflies and hawk moths in particular, which you can see there in his collection, very proudly displayed. Because South Florida butterflies and moths were so sought after by collectors around the world, and because there were few other resident collectors in his area, Bates actually became plugged into a national and even international networks of butterfly and collecting at a very young age, and correspondence networks at that young age. And at the same time, he really devoured travel narratives of naturalists like Henry Walter Bates, no relation, Alfred Russel Wallace, and William Beebe, who was publishing his books when Bates was a teenager. And Bates nursed the idea of one day collecting in lands further south, more tropical than rural Florida. Here is his freshman essay, Why I Want to Go to South America, in 1923, which he actually refers back to in a later book of his, saying he finds it a little cringy, basically. not the words he used, but he still basically feels the same way about it. So in rural South Florida, he scoured the hammocks of the Everglades, looking for rare ligus tree snails and caterpillars with his best friend, Sandy Fairchild. And they kind of role-played together as Bates and Wallace, or Humboldt and Bonpland, imagining they were trekking through South America together. And Sandy Fairchild, his best friend at the time, was also his future brother-in-law and the son of the famous plant explorer David Fairchild, who has had biographies written of him before, and is one reason we have avocados and kudzu and things like that in this country. So the connection with the wealthy and well-connected Fairchilds was really life-changing for Bates, and came about because Marston's father, who was by trade a postal clerk, was also an amateur horticulturalist. And in fact, his dad carved out an impressive citrus and avocado grove out of the thick stand of pines and palmettos that grew on their farmstead, aptly named, I think you can see from this photo, Sandy Acres. The Bates family was certainly not alone in altering the landscape. They had arrived in South Florida on the cusp of a land boom that would absolutely transform the state. And in fact, Sandy Acres is now kind of in the center of Fort Lauderdale and would be basically unrecognizable to them. In fact, as Bates grew up in the teens and 20s, he watched the landscapes he loved give way to drainage canals, roads, citrus fields, hotels. In fact, he took this photo of the effects of one of the first all-over fires to decimate the Everglades. You can still see some trees far in the background, but it's all a burned over area. He did not yet have any coherent environmentalist critique as a teenager. But at the University of Florida, north in Gainesville, he used his English class essays to give vent to his frustrations with the land speculation and construction boom that left, quote, a tragedy, a futuristic landscape of splotches and lines and signboards. And living through the land boom really fostered Bates's sense of irony and I would say an outsider's perspective from his own culture and society, something that really might have already been present given his experience of same-sex attraction in the context of a society that casts such attraction as unnatural. So there's a mixture of his environment and human nature kind of at play in the story as well. At the University of Florida, he really had to work hard to fit in among the frat boys. For example, he found keeping his insect collection in the fraternity house was a very bad idea. But he did find close mentorship from very young professors at the time. The biologist T.H. Hubble, known as Hub, and J. Speed Rogers, who emphasized the study of organisms within their ecological context through a lot of local field studies. And so Speed and Hub introduced Bates to the science of ecology, which itself was a new field, relatively speaking, at the time. And they also introduced him to his vocation in life. Well, one that competed with his interest in writing, actually, which he also found around this time. Graduate school, though, was out of the question. The Florida boom went bust in Bates's senior year, and it was really kind of precipitated by the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926, which not only wiped out the orchards, at least temporarily, at Sandy Acres, it also brought down the whole kind of economic house of cards of that Florida land boom. Land values just plummeted overnight, and the state sank into a deep depression 3 years ahead of the rest of the country. Bates needed a job. And that's going to bring me to my second case. This one kind of consecutive with the first. Well, economic entomology didn't really excite him very much. He did have experience with it working at the experiment station at University of Florida. But he'd been told that the American fruit companies always had a place for a young college man. So he got a job with the United Fruit Company, thinking it'll get him to the tropics, where he'd always wanted to go, and perhaps he could pursue his natural history interests on the side, right? And it ended up, some strings needed to be pulled. It wasn't as easy as he thought, but he knew the Fairchilds, and they knew people in United Fruit, and Bates ultimately was hired as a research assistant, first stationed at the company's Lancetia experiment station in Honduras, which you can see here. And at Lancetia, he worked for Wilson Popenoe, who was a protege of David Fairchild, and who was then researching a wide range of potential future new crops for land that was either unsuitable for the bananas that United Fruit mainly cultivated, or else could possibly replace bananas in lands that had become kind of degraded and unsuitable for banana monocultures. And Papineau assigned Bates to like a really bewildering array of entomological problems, given that the whole plan was to introduce a bunch of different fruit and other kind of crops. And so Bates is studying aphids on coffee plants, moths on pomelos, scale insects on star fruit, mealybugs on custard apples, and many, many other things. And he finds a lot of this kind of dull or mind-numbing, but he does get pulled in at times, like the problem of fruit flies as pests on citrus crops, right? It raises interesting ecological questions. Questions of their ecology, of their behavior and classification, questions of the organism interacting with its environment. And these are, I would say, also to signpost very different questions about fruit flies than historians of biology have focused on at the same period. So that gives you a little bit sense of his different perspective as well. So Bates brought his ecological perspective that he'd been trained in to bear on his work. And in doing so, he also began to see how humans fit into the whole picture. So in this manual that he wrote on insect pests for Central American growers, Bates emphasized how insects were part of a larger ecological community. He did give instructions for control methods, pesticides, but he actually emphasized, given how expensive such things were and kind of impractical in a lot of cases, he emphasized the preferability of some biological control methods. He explained the distinction between beneficial and harmful insects from his point of view was basically he didn't use this word, but a human construction. It really depended on what your intentions were. A group of insects that might become a pest in certain agricultural contexts might be harmless in other contexts. And in the context of agriculture, I'd say he came to see insect-plant relations as always taking place within this kind of social context, or maybe ecological context, to explain it that way. He also became somewhat more aware of the social context and politics of science. So after a year with the company, he was actually sort of promoted to independent work in Guatemala as part of a short-lived company technical service. The Servicio Técnico was kind of like an agricultural extension agency aimed at really improving the company's kind of bad image with independent growers in Guatemala. And fresh out of college still, basically, Bates found it, he has journal entries at this time, and he is finding it incredibly uncomfortable to be trying to give advice to experienced coffee growers when he is fresh out of college. He barely has this, he knows he's not even dressed properly for this job. He has no credibility, really. He's just come to Guatemala for the first time. So more than giving them advice, he mostly is listening to a lot of complaints. And that's partly what the company wants him to do, because they want to use him as a spy, essentially. It takes him a while to realize that's what's going on. But he listens to endless complaints from growers. And he begins to formulate some of his own complaints as well, which his journals have. And these focused, I would say, only to a limited degree on the kinds of things scholars or contemporary critics of United Fruit would have focused on. Not the company's dubious politics or monopolistic practices of his already controversial employer, but instead Bates tended to focus on the company's lackluster and inconsistent support for scientific research, not surprisingly, or in the behavior of his fellow American banana cowboys, as they were known. And he was appalled, for example, by those other company employees who'd been there for more than a decade, decades even, and could not be bothered to learn Spanish. And I think it's fair to say that also in the kind of social world he's a part of with the company, he feels a growing sense of alienation from the ideal of North American white masculinity that pervaded the company. But during this period, Bates certainly came to love Latin America, both its cultures and its countryside. And he felt most at home kind of when he was able to go beyond the company enclaves. Now, he rarely did have as much time as he once hoped he would for actual natural history work. And years later, he would write that though he had, quote, loved the rainforest from his first encounter in Honduras, he, quote, never really appreciated it until later in life. He never really appreciated it, although he witnessed and wrote about in his journals and letters home the clearing of rainforests to make way for endless new banana plantations, filling a seemingly insatiable appetite in the north for bananas. In 1931, Bates finally left the company, not at least in any direct way, because of a burgeoning political or environmental awareness. Instead, as the Great Depression set in, United Fruit lost its appetite for investment and research, and Bates's prospects for advancement seemed increasingly limited. In fact, he feared he might be fired, and he got out while he could, and he headed for grad school finally. Now, a Harvard PhD opened doors for Bates, and he was very lucky to snag a job with the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Division in 1935. But I'm going to break from the narrative and move episodically here forward to 1940 for a kind of third kind of moment or example from his life. And in 1940, Bates now found himself in Villavicencio, Colombia. He was now director of his own laboratory, the Foundation's field laboratory for the study of yellow fever. He was also now a husband and a father. He had married his friend from childhood, Nancy Bell Fairchild, that was Sandy's sister. And together, Marston and Nancy had actually evacuated his last post in Egypt in 1940 as she was pregnant and as the World War spread. And they were reposted to Colombia. Villavicencio was a frontier town known as the gateway to the Llanos, which is the vast tropical savanna of the Orinoco Basin. And this was a region that was also undergoing transformation, this time by cattle ranching and the expanding oil industry. And during his 5 years with the foundation kind of leading up to this point, Bates had refashioned himself as an expert not in crop pests, not in butterflies, but in mosquito behavior and ecology. He had studied malaria in the Mediterranean. He had been taught to see the world from the mosquito's point of view, in the words of his mentor. Bates's job here in Colombia was now to tackle the tricky problem of jungle or sylvan yellow fever. Yellow fever was then understood, had been understood, to be a disease of cities, of port cities, of urban areas where it was transmitted among people by Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. And it had been thought to be basically under control. But unexpected new outbreaks had been reported from remote rural areas around the tropical world, including Colombia's Llanos. And these outbreaks were especially confusing because they seemed to occur in the absence of the known mosquito vector species. So hence the need for biological study. The Villavicencio lab was remote and rather Spartan, but I would say it was not actually isolated. Its research was made possible by its location at the nexus of local, regional, and international networks of science and commerce. The Llanos were both the focus of international development efforts by the Colombian state and an area of interest to international companies, most notably Tropical Oil Company, which was a subsidiary of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which is now ExxonMobil. And these economic interests shaped the Rockefeller Foundation's particular concern with yellow fever. Institutionally, the lab, Bates's lab in Villavicencio, reported to the Rockefeller Foundation's office in Bogota, which cooperated, although not without tensions, with Colombian authorities. That's the kind of local and regional connections institutionally. At the same time, the lab was part of a much larger constellation of Rockefeller virus labs that were in Africa, Brazil, the Caribbean, and which circulated these local observations in order to see broader patterns in yellow fever's epidemiology and what Bates would say its ecology. Within the Llanos, the lab's daily work also depended on a steady flow of research material from the countryside, from the hinterland. Mosquitoes that were caught in rainforests, liver samples taken from rural fever victims, monkeys, and a myriad other mammals that might be hosting the virus acquired through the region's very vigorous wildlife trade. And locally, maintaining good relations between the laboratory and the town was also crucial. here Nancy Bates played a key role, I would say, through her charity work, friendships, deep involvement with the Villavicencio community. And I would say that Bates would not have survived there very long without her kind of local diplomatic work in that way. The boundaries between the laboratory and the domestic sphere were gendered, but they were also surprisingly porous. So in her own book, she published a book before he ever did, in 1947, East of the Andes, West of Nowhere, with that striking title, A Naturalist's Wife in Colombia. Nancy writes about how she schooled their growing family of 3 daughters in a room in the laboratory, how lab animals sometimes came home as pets. And this book also, by the way, spurred Bates to write as well. So ultimately, the interdisciplinary research of Bates and the Colombian staff at the Villavicencio lab elucidated what came to be known as the sylvatic cycle, or the forest cycle, of yellow fever, whereby monkeys and mosquitoes living in forest canopies in the countryside kind of maintain a natural reservoir of the yellow fever virus. And it's only when people enter the forest, when, in this image, woodcutters felled trees and came into contact with mosquitoes from the canopy, that yellow fever spilled over into human populations in rural areas. Particularly areas like the Llanos, where accelerating settlement and economic development is mixing human and animal populations that previously had remained fairly separate. The problem of sylvan yellow fever then brought into sharp focus for Bates the complexity of the ecological relations in nature, as well as how inextricable humans were from this broader web of life. And no sooner than the lab had basically untangled this complex disease ecology of yellow fever than the rise of DDT seemed to provide a quick technological fix. And under the increasing pressure from the Colombian health authorities, the foundation transitioned the lab to focus on more pressing public health problems of malaria instead of yellow fever. Bates changes his whole research program, but he stubbornly resists demands to make the Villavicencio lab a site of chemical control efforts. Housing DDT and research populations in the same building, right, is not a great idea necessarily. So it's a tense place at the lab as these kind of geopolitical and different visions are coming together. And there's simmering institutional and interpersonal conflict at the lab. It finally boils over in 1948, just as Colombia plummets into la violencia following the assassination of presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. And the laboratory effectively is nationalized at that point. Bates, his family evacuates Colombia. They leave behind what had been their home for 8 years. And then back in the United States, Bates turns increasingly to writing for the public. I'm skipping over a lot of things because I'm trying to make this episodic. But in some ways, Bates's mid-century transition from research scientist to public scientist isn't a unique story at all. Bates was one of a lot of scientists who were turning to publishing for wider audiences during this post-war era. He wasn't alone in feeling stirred, really almost obsessed by a burgeoning awareness of the social responsibility of science. And along with the works of other scientist writers like Rachel Carson, like Lauren Isley, like Paul Ehrlich, or maybe René Dubos, Bates's books were part of a broader genre of science and environmental writing that brought ecology to a broader audience for the first time. Yet I think that Bates's perspective differed from these better-known contemporaries as well. After all, for 2 decades, he had chased agricultural pests and vectors of human diseases on 4 continents. He had been a frontline worker in schemes basically to develop what would soon be dubbed the Third World. And he had confronted problems of monoculture, of disease ecology, of population growth. He had seen revolutions, been forced from 3 labs by oncoming war, and worked at the blurry boundary between science and geopolitics. And Bates drew on these experiences in his writings, both directly in the examples and places that he wrote about to illustrate different scientific and environmental ideas, and indirectly. In fact, his books, especially after breaking off from the Rockefeller Foundation in 1952, became critical of neocolonial international development efforts, of what he called the American missionary movement that he had once been a part of. And increasingly, if gently and often humorously, he questioned and challenged his readers' assumptions that Western culture had all the right answers about how to live on this planet. And especially in his final writings, Gluttons and Libertines and Jungle in the House, although his readers didn't know it, he also drew on his experience as a queer man married to a woman who had to navigate the boundary between what is natural and what is cultural in human behavior and society. And so I think it's no wonder then that his work focused on questioning and breaking down dichotomies like man and nature. As Bates warned in perhaps his most influential book, the ecological game of let's pretend man doesn't exist was as unfair as the corresponding game of the economists. Let's pretend that nature doesn't exist. The economy of nature and the ecology of man are inseparable, and attempts to separate them are more than misleading, they are dangerous. Man's destiny is tied to nature's destiny. So let me step back, pause there, and turn to some of these broader kind of methods questions that might be interesting to discuss, I hope, and that I signposted at the beginning. Questions like, how do biography and environmental history intersect? What are the tensions between these approaches, especially with regard to things like narrative focus, scale, agency, and how might they complement each other? As you, I hope, can see from the episodes from Bates's life that I shared with you, my book that is in progress, I'll share the, as it stands, table of contents. Each chapter of the manuscript is really grounded successively in place before turning in the second half of the book to broader questions of the global environment and questions that he worked with across his different books, his public writing. And the structure really reflects the episodic quality of Bates's own life and career. He moved from place to place, from project to project throughout his life. And without tracing his life, they might seem like utterly different kinds of places and projects to work on. My hope is that across these chapters, by tracing Bates's life, I can at the same time give the reader a kind of intimate, ground-level view of what ultimately is global change, bringing questions also of power and of knowledge and of individual agency to the fore, things that I think are lost in kind of global environmental histories that operate on a bird's eye level view. So the places where Bates worked, in the cases I talked about with you, Florida, Central America, Colombia, in some ways they couldn't be more different culturally or ecologically. In each place, Bates had to familiarize himself with different institutions, with different scientific disciplines, with different organisms, from butterflies to fruit flies to mosquitoes, and then ultimately to humans in his later writing. But these places also experience similar kinds of environmental transformations: drainage, deforestation, settlement, things that were driven by some comparable or connected root causes, the expansion of international capital, US power. These experiences shaped his development as a scientist and his perspective on human nature and the natural world, and they informed his later public writings. And in fact, the episodic quality of Bates's life is in part what drew me to the project. You know, when I was writing my first book and wrestling as I revised the dissertation into a book, problems of organization and when to stop, the narrative, I recall really naively thinking how nice it would be to write a biography of Bates where, like, you have the beginning, you have the end. He moved from place to place on a regular basis. It's like the chapters are there. It divides up so neatly. I can tell you it has not been nearly as easy as that. Happy to talk about that more. However, one thing that has helped me in approaching what ends up being a very complex story here is thinking about this book manuscript specifically as an environmental biography. While certainly not a large genre, there are at least a handful of very good books that have been framed as environmental biographies, and one, of course, is Mark's own. My work is that of conservation. And I know it's a title or a genre that you said your publisher kind of foisted upon you, environmental biography, but I think it's apt because as I take it, environmental biography is not simply any biography that examines the life of, say, an environmentalist or an environmental author or a figure in the history of conservation or environmental policy or something like that, but rather environmental biography is really kind of a broad approach that centers on the relationship and mutual shaping of the biographical subject and the active natural world around them. So like almost a dual biography of person and place. And in the case of Mark's study of Carver, he's interested not only in reconceiving Carver as a prophet of sustainable agriculture, but through Carver's life, right, he's able to tell a larger story about agriculture and environmental change in the southern Black Belt. And there's also, in this small genre, there's Jack Davis's biography of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in the Everglades, Bert Way's study of Herbert Stoddard and the Red Hills Longleaf Pine Woods, Stephen P. Holmes on the young John Muir and the far-flung environments that shaped his youth. And this, I think, is the first book to kind of self-consciously define environmental biography as an approach. With Bates, perhaps foolishly, I really am concerned with trying to balance both external and internal change with him, his development, and that of these multiple environments around him. Bates's role as an observer and participant in the environmental changes he witnessed around him in this changing rural world. At the same time, something I focused less on in this talk, but which I think is equally important, I'm going to bring up now, is the development of his own critical and even queer perspective on humans and nature. But what is internal and external anyway? I think environmental biography kind of leads us to think about these questions. And to kind of play around with this idea at the very end of the talk here, I'm going to bring up some of Bates's own words again. So Bates addressed questions of internal and external when trying to explain the field of biology itself to his readers. And he started out in explaining kind of what the field of biology looks like to his readers, but with the individual organism, which he says here is the nearest thing to an objective category in biology. And as a loose analogy, I'm going to say, perhaps we might say the same thing in history of the individual, the closest thing to an objective category, perhaps. In any case, Bates suggested that it might be useful to distinguish skin-in biology from what he called skin-out biology. That is, to distinguish research that focused on the internal workings of the individual, organs, tissues, cells, molecules, from research that focused on the organism as a whole, its ecological and environmental and evolutionary relationships. And he pointed out how different sorts of methods were really needed for these different sides of biological research, though he thought all were necessary. Now, the individual for biologists is arguably a quite different kind of entity than the individual is for historians and biographers, though maybe for environmental historians, the distinction is not as strong. Historians are concerned with humans as biological agents. But I wonder if we could stretch or momentarily experiment with this parallel between Bates's framing of skin-in versus skin-out biology and what might be called skin-in or skin-out biography. So put simply, how do we position the individual in relation to the broader external seeming historical processes, events, institutions, context? Conversely, how do we approach the biographical subject's internal life, right? Here, of course, I don't mean their cells and DNA, but rather their motivations, experiences, perceptions, intimate relationships with others, understandings of themselves. And this is a really, really tough methods problem, given that those sorts of things are not directly accessible to us, not in any transparent way through primary sources. Even when I have journals, I can't really know what he's thinking, right? So how do we decide how much weight to give each side, the more external, the more internal in our narratives? And in large part, going back to what initially drew me to this project, it was a very skin-out kind of question, right? How, following Bates's life, might allow me to tie together major themes, usually seen as disparate themes in the history of science, agriculture, medicine, environment, and how to situate these in larger US and global historical contexts. But I think from the beginning, I also was drawn to a more internal, skin-in question of Bates's life trajectory and perspective. How did someone who had spent most of his career working for United Fruit and the Rockefeller Foundation come to be critical of Northern impositions of power on the global South and their effect on people and the environment? Why did he make this dramatic career shift, after all, from applied entomology to writing for the public on questions of humanity's place in nature? When, then, through oral histories during the pandemic, when I couldn't get into archives, I came to understand that his daughters, former students, friends, knew Marston Bates as a gay man, this also raised important questions for me about his internal and personal life that I couldn't ignore and that I hadn't initially seen in the archives. And something I could not ignore without really doing a disservice, I think, and like straight washing history, right? So it raises other kinds of questions, like how did he understand his sexual identity over time, which is a period of time, the 20th century, during which scientific and cultural understandings of sexuality were in flux as well. How did his sexual identity shape his place within the institutions that he worked in, right? And how did his changing sexual identity shape his relationship with Nancy, with his wife? And finally, and most directly important and relevant to the project as an environmental biography, how might his sexuality have shaped his understandings of nature, in particular of human nature? So his interest in cultural anthropology and public exploration of human nature in the 50s and 60s appear to have emerged alongside, actually, his increasing openness about his sexualities, at least among friends, in the 1950s. So what's clear for me now is that for Bates, the question of human nature was crucial to the question, actually, of human survival on this planet, of freedom in the face of environmental crisis. And for him, the question was, as cultural animals, would we be able to change ourselves in order to live on this planet without destroying it, without destroying ourselves? And I hope it's clear that these questions almost immediately break down that skin in versus skin out framing in biography that I kind of set up. To begin to answer them, I can't separate Bates as a person, as a whole person with an interiority, however incompletely accessible to me, from his historical context, from the broader world in which he was a part. And ultimately, Bates also recognized this distinction between the individual and the external environment as arbitrary also in biology. As he put it in one of his later talks, quote, "If I eat an apple, when does the apple stop being a part of my environment and start being a part of me? If one has parasites, is one entitled to use the pronoun we?" And of course, crossing the skin in, skin out boundary, it was crucial in his own research career. He studied mosquito-borne diseases. Nothing could better bring home the permeability of the skin as a boundary, right? The mosquito's bite links biological processes across scales from the ecosystem to the microbe, and it requires multiple perspectives, multiple disciplines to really understand. And so this, by way of a loose analogy, a little thought experiment, is instructive, I think, of how, as I continue to write, I am trying to approach Bates as the subject of an environmental biography, and all that might mean. So the interior and the exterior, not so separate as I originally assumed, and I hope by going deeper, maybe I can tell a bigger story. So I'm gonna stop there, hear what you have to say, and think about it, and looking forward to your questions.
I love this, and I had actually been working through the chapters that you circulated as part of the consortium working group, and I'm sorry, group of 10, I had class at that time. It's a great project, and what stood out to me when I was reading, and then it came out even more when you were talking, and these interesting methodological issues, he seems like he's kind of the Forrest Gump of habitat destruction, like he's just kind of there, but it also seems like your intention with whether or not he's just there, right? And I guess, do you see over the course of his whole life that he starts to actually kind of reflect upon his role as advancing this, the land boom, these various sort of like destructions of nature, if he's seeing a distinction, which I guess you're showing that he's muddying all of that. But does he reflect on his own specific role as part of these larger neo-colonial systems?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I do think he should be seen as part of that, because why he's, well, maybe not his, he should be seen of them, he should be seen as part of them even in the childhood episode I gave you, because he's able to collect in what Rob Kohler called like inner frontiers. Like it's accessible because of this settlement. This wilderness is accessible because of the settlement, paradoxically, for naturalists to study, and because of what his father is doing and his mentors and all of this. But in the case of his work with United Fruit and with the Rockefeller Foundation, he's there to mop up and keep things going keep development going that's encountering the limits of nature, right? Right, there are crop pests because there are monocultures, right? Which he knows, right? He critiques monoculture, but that's nothing new with him, actually. He's drawing on a lot of existing training, right? But he's there to keep it stumbling forward. Frank Euclid used that phrase, and it's stuck in my head. Keeping monoculture stumbling forward, despite all the critiques. And with the Rockefeller Foundation, likewise, really, he's there studying malaria in Europe and the Mediterranean, actually, and North Africa and the Balkans, and Albania is where he's stationed most of the time. In the part I didn't talk about with you, he's there because there is interest in developing these kind of marginal lands, and he has to leave because Mussolini invades Albania, and then he has to leave Egypt. So he does reflect on this, and he kind of half excuses himself. So he situates himself in the Rockefeller Foundation as kind of part of their, and he was part of their research wing, right? He's not out there doing control efforts. He's not out there even providing vaccines or he's not out there to cure or ameliorate. He's there to study. And so I wish I had the actual quote to bring up because it's more, I think more subtle than what I'm giving here. But he did think about his place, and he says, I like to think that at least I was a part of, he never critiques the Rockefeller Foundation as a whole. I think he thinks as a whole, it was trying to do some things that he doesn't think are so bad, but he's not always happy with the rationale behind it, and with the unintended effects. But he kind of exculpates himself because he was just researching. But he wouldn't be there researching without this other stuff. He's enabling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I have one more sort of follow-up.
Sorry for my long-winded answers to everything.
It's also because I don't know how to formulate this into questions, but it seems like also that, and I know this is like a tricky balance when you're writing biography and you don't want it to all go back to one thing or another, but it seems like growing up in Florida as the landscape is changing all around him all the time had to have been formative just in sort of tolerating that change, right? It's not like he goes away to college and comes back and all of a sudden his town is gone, or like the nature is gone and it's been replaced by a city, but like to like sort of grow up seeing the constant changes of the land seems like this also allows for like a higher tolerance.
I don't know, because on the one hand, he, like other naturalists, kind of thinks this sort of thing is inevitable. So when he's in, or they directly think it's inevitable, and maybe they can preserve a little patch of it somewhere. So when he's in Central America, like he really doesn't. I mean, there's still plenty of nature for him to see, and so he doesn't have those sorts of critiques there. I do think, and another part of the very long, big story is the last assignment that he gets with the Rockefeller Foundation is their human ecology program. So after he has to leave Columbia, they have to find something for him to do. And they're like, why don't you work on what we're calling human ecology, which is really their global population growth research. And so he's based in New York, but he's going around and meeting everyone who works on any discipline that is relevant in any way to this very broad framing of what might be of interest to thinking about human population, because the foundation has been critiqued in Malthusian ways by eradicating disease, you're increasing the population, and there's a Malthusian critique to be made there, and they want to counter this, and they think it would be helpful to have a biologist to speak on this particular argument, especially because of who is making the argument, our other biologists. So his thoughts about human population growth, I think, don't sit easily in the very polarized way we tend to talk about positions on. He never wants to sit in these polarized positions on things. But I do think he is inclined to see population as a problem because he has seen this happen where he is from. He has seen this growth. That's interestingly different than the sorts of population growth is a problem in India or something, right? He writes the book on population, the prevalence of people, which makes nowhere near a kind of splash that such books before or after made, probably because it was quite moderate and is ultimately, this is a problem that you can't separate from human culture and values. Individual families are the ones kind of making up these decisions, and so we can't rush in and tell people what to do. And that's not a book that people can mobilize around, right? And he dedicates it to his 4 children, by the way, because population problems, pleasantly enough, start at home. So there's some kind of, anyway. Where am I going with this? I'm just telling you, I know I have the biographer's disease where I tell you too much detail about everything. But I do think that growing up in Florida, it didn't make him tolerant of it. I think it made him apt to see population growth as a problem and connected with development and progress, of which he was highly skeptical. But later in life, he doesn't hate this. He doesn't necessarily want to live in cities, but he doesn't hate the city the way he's interested in urban ecology and things like that in some of those later books. So, big sloppy answer to your questions. Go ahead.
Megan, I just want to say thank you so much for this. My book project has a lot of, not overlap, but similar kind of trajectory as yours, and you've given me so much to think about, and I really appreciate it, and please finish your book soon so then I don't have to think about these things. I can just cite you, that would be great. I wanted to hear more about sort of queering science and his queer identity. It's something that you brought up a few different times. But I'm just looking, I looked up when he died, and I was thinking about the sort of trajectory of his life. I mean, he lived through the Kinsey books being published and the data therein. He lived through the homophile movement and the Manicheans. He lived through Stonewall. He lived through the APA protests and homosexuality being removed from the DSM. I'm just wondering how, you've been focusing obviously on his reflections on the environment and society, but I'm wondering about his reflections on queerness and how that might have shaped. He must have written about being queer for you to be writing about him being queer, or did he? Did he reflect on this? Did he? Kinsey was an entomologist.
They had the same advisor at Harvard. They were both students of William Morton Wheeler.
Was he one of the people that Kinsey interviewed? Because that would have been fascinating.
I have indeed wanted to know if that was the case, and I contacted the Kinsey archives, and there's nothing I can get that would. They knew each other, and they were friends. They knew each other as correspondents before they became. They weren't advisees of Wheeler at the same time. Mm-hmm. But when Bates is interested in fruit flies, which form galls, he and Kinsey nerded up over wasp galls. So there's some lovely, friendly correspondence between them. And then they meet later, and he, I haven't gotten to this part yet, but I do think he's one of the kind of defenders of Kinsey in the Rockefeller Foundation, not very closely related to the issues that Kinsey faced there. But Bates wrote about homosexuality in his latter two books. The last book was actually a collection of essays from Natural History magazine. So a presumed heterosexuality is part of his public persona, not surprisingly. I would say, let me try to be as brief as possible. In Gluttons and Libertines, which is a book about food and sex. So food and sex are, as he puts it, both the most cultural things you can imagine, because every culture has different kinds of norms and practices with regard to eating and sex, right? But they're also the most biological. What could be more biological, right? And so he plays with that boundary. And again, it's one of these books that does not do as well as The Naked Ape, which comes out at the same time, right? He has not got this reductionist perspective. In fact, it might frustrate people because it kind of goes back and forth on this, and he's like, well, he doesn't think there's nothing natural, there's no human nature, but he does say culture is kind of swamped nature. So what does that mean? If culture is natural, what do you do with all that? And also he's trying to be funny in it. It's a funny book, and people don't take humor seriously. So anyway, so that book almost queers itself when you read it now with any knowledge. And the knowledge I have comes first from the people I talk to. So I would have messed this book up, hope that I finish it, if I had not interviewed first his daughters, and that I could Zoom with them because it was COVID and women in their 70s and 80s were happy to Zoom with me at that time, and they're fantastic. And if they end up watching this, it was life-changingly amazing to talk with them actually. So what I know first comes from them, and then also from interviewing a whole bunch of other people, all of whom, I never brought this up with, but they all wanted to tell me this. So I don't know how he actually identified himself.
But it seems like it was significant enough that all of the people close to him
Yes.
would see that as essential to understanding him.
Yes.
And that they needed to address it with you in order to, maybe this isn't just an environmental biography,
Yeah.
it's a queer environmental biography.
Yes, and I do frame it that way. For this, I thought one thing at a time is 45 minutes. I know I give a wide-ranging talk already. Yes, I am thinking of it as both an environmental and a queer biography. And interestingly, I start to find that there are methodological questions that are, both fields are centrally concerned with the problem of nature, and that is the central concern of Bates. Now, that's a very big problem, so in some ways it covers a multitude of sins, but really it helps unify things. And in fact, I guess that's fine if that, should I just do this? Okay. Really that when I talked to the Bates daughters, I suddenly felt like, okay, I actually understand this story now. Even though I had not expected them to say 5 minutes into the conversation, the eldest daughter says, hey, so you do know that our dad was gay, right? And I said, no, I did not. Then subsequently looking back, getting to see the rest of his papers, because I hadn't seen them all when the pandemic started, seeing the rest of his papers, and then the daughters also kindly invited me to Nova Scotia and the Alexander Graham Bell estate, because Alexander Graham Bell is Nancy Bates's grandfather, where they have her papers that are private and unarchived, and there's additional material there. So he never identifies himself in any particular way, and everyone told me, we didn't use labels, right? Like, there were gay men who were at the house. Some of them lived there sometimes. But we didn't think those are gay men. Like, we just thought that was so-and-so's name, you know? And there were a lot of different kinds of people in their house. I have not gotten to the latter part of the story, the social world of in Ann Arbor in the 50s and 60s. At their house, it was a scene, man. It was an amazing scene. And once you understand the context in which those latter books are written, it's like his field site for Gluttons and Libertines and Jungle in the House are like this house. For Jungle in the House, literally, like, he did build a greenhouse that he called his experimental rainforest, and that had like plants and hummingbirds and all this stuff in it. But there's also like there's like ecologists, ecology grad students meeting together and finding the experience of being in their house like meaningfully life-changing. Like, oh, I can be myself here. And some of them because they realize that they are gay, and some just for other reasons, you know, or like someone emailed me out of the blue, I can't believe you're writing about Marston Bates. This was a founder of Greenpeace, and he was like, I think you could call him founder, and like, he was like, Bates like took me into the greenhouse and like explained what ecology meant to me for the first time. So the personal interactions also just are really meaningful, and I think have a whole importance connected to but separate from the written stuff. I think I went off on a different tangent.
No, this is fascinating. Thank you, Megan.
But so I think it's a challenge, and it's not easy to do in a short talk. To do what I'm trying to do, writing slowly, you can, without putting him in a box or categorizing him, exploring the kinds of things he's thinking and saying that I can get from his writing, but also knowing a broader story.
How many words is this book going?
Yeah, that's worrisome. It's worrisome at this point.
Are you going to pull Janet Brown and do 2 volumes?
I cannot do 2 volumes. No. Okay, sorry, long-winded answers again. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
So you mentioned the population bomb, and by the way, I'm always looking for, like, you know, when someone starts to talk, for that first detail that kind of like draws me in, and him being an Alfred Russel Wallace cosplayer.
Yes.
I love it. You know, he didn't go for the obvious one. He didn't go to Darwin. He went right to Wallace. But like thinking of Wallace as a popularizer, which was, you know, sort of the stock and trade after he came back. You know, thinking about Paul Ehrlich and Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson, and, you know, there's a whole sort of canon of people who are writing about nature in this way for a certain kind of middle-brow audience, just all over these you know, few decades. Do you know anything about how he saw himself with respect to that? Because I love that slide you had about the different kinds of books he's writing. He's writing high school textbooks and, you know, like, you know, serious ecological works, but also, you know, these other things. Do you have any sense of, like, did he see himself as, like, did his mission change, or was he just like, oh, this is a fun way to sort of, you know, keep myself relevant in the public eye?
Yeah, no, he definitely, so his first effort to write, he thinks for the public, is this natural history of mosquitoes. But really, that is a book that is not aimed at the broad public, but he does succeed at like bringing together a bunch of different scientific disciplines that connect over mosquitoes that were not really talking to each other as much as you might think they would. And it is accessible in the way that, you know, to be interdisciplinary, you need to be accessible. But he realizes as soon as he's done with it that it hasn't gone as far as he really wanted to go. And he even has some letters with René Dubos about this. They're both like trying to write for the public and realize their first efforts are really not for quite, like, that's a problem we all might have. We think we're writing for this broad audience, and it's like, no, not really. So he tries again with Nature of Natural History, and I would say that that really is for a pretty broad, I mean, that was used as textbook, used as, you know, not like textbooks, but that reaches does mostly succeed. And his later books are more and more kind of popular over time. And he had a TV program, he was on TV and things like that. None of them survive. If anyone knows where those might be found, I would love to know. He was part of the whole publishing landscape in the post-war period. So his his literary agent was Darmid Russell, who was a a very famous literary agent for mostly novelists and things, but Eudora Welty and stuff like that. And there's conversations there about like what it is they're aiming for, and he's trying to get articles in various glossy magazines and things too, and he is behind the scenes, like all the kind of machinery that goes into publishing during this period, like reviewing, like both behind the scenes and writing reviews, and mentioning other authors that editors or literary agents might like. He's a part of that conversation, and it's clear to me that like certain people are like, well, what's his opinion about stuff? So in some ways, the writing part goes beyond like his actual books. He was kind of like I wish I didn't use this one slide that is like a book ad for Jungle in the House that has like Lauren Isley is like blurbing him, and Isaac Asimov is blurbing him, and other people we don't remember are blurbing him, but we do remember most of them, and he was like a standard kind of, not like a bestseller, but like a standard kind of person on that landscape. And then he's writing in Natural History magazine for like 2 years, pre like Stephen Jay Gould, yeah. So,
Sorry.
yeah. Oh yeah, I'm wandering.
The
Yeah.
TV show, did he have his own program?
He had his own program
Oh, okay.
called Science Quest and Conquest, which doesn't sound like a very Batesy title, but I don't know. University of Michigan had a whole TV thing, but it got distributed widely, and I'm hoping that somewhere some distributor kept them, because all University of Michigan has is the scripts, and the scripts are. It is helpful though, although Bates didn't read from scripts, so it's just sort of like an outline. And in fact, there's like a how to do like this sort of scholarly like TV show type thing. Like there's an example of one of the scripts in like one of these published books about that sort of thing. And he appeared on like the California Academy of Science. He appeared on 2 episodes of that. They only have 1 that survives, and so I have a little bit of footage of him, and that is it. He also gave radio addresses, and there's one of those. And Nancy Bates, also, there's a little bit of film of her, because she also was a pretty significant member of Planned Parenthood of Michigan, and was an abortion advocate, and there's a short blurb of her in a otherwise incredibly patronizing film about women doing stuff, But her part is interesting, because she says she started to get into this work because she thought she was interested in population, but what she's actually interested in is people. And I actually found that quite moving, even though it sounds like sort of a soundbite. She says it in a really meaningful way, not like it was pre-prepared. So anyway, other thoughts, questions, feedback at all? Because I'm in the midst of it, guys. It is, yeah. I'm well into writing it. Yeah.
You could name parts 1 and 2, The Power of Place and Voyage.
Yeah, no 2 volumes. I do want grad students to ask me questions. Please, I do not bite. I will be joining you in happy hour, I hear, but you can ask things now, too.
So I'm curious, when sort of towards the end of your presentation, you talked about his queer identity, that you write that out.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but harken back to his wife's, the title of his book.
Yeah.
It's almost like, I don't know if it's, obviously maybe the book's not subtly trying to tell you anything, but I wonder, is there anything in her writings that may influence or like sort of subtly nod to this either tension in their relationship or like negotiations they have made because of this identity? I'm just trying to think creatively of like written source material.
I do have written source material, and I would say I also didn't, I don't, nothing jumps out at me right now about that particular book. It is a really, it's very frustrating that she never wrote another book. She did write a couple of articles after that, but she has these 4 children and a lot of other things that she's doing, and she does try to start writing again later in life, and has one piece in the Jungle in the House, actually, about like when the cockroaches explode out of the greenhouse and into the house, and it's really funny and great. But anyway, yes, there are letters between them later on in that later. I haven't written about this period yet. I have a lot of thoughts, and I don't know if they're ready for like prime time. So I want to be really careful. And this is also being recorded, and so I don't want to have like undigested thoughts out there. But I do think there is quite a bit of relevant written textual material once I know how to read it, and that shines light on their relationship. And there's also quite a bit of oral history that leads me to say that I think that it seems that he became open about this in the 50s, maybe also to himself. Mm-hmm. And I do have some writing of her own that starts off as writing a letter to him about, like, essentially, it's a tough letter. It's like, what have I been doing wrong? Like, what's wrong here? I'll leave it at that. And at the end of it, she ends it with, this is a little tough for I'm realizing the camera again, but she ends it with basically, now I understand the value of writing a journal for oneself. And I don't think she ever gave him that, but she continues to write, but it's clear to me that they have spoken. And she has accepted this. Yeah. And she and other things that happen later on that from oral discussions, I know that, like, the people who were graduate students and hung out at their house, like, it's pretty clear to me she's like, please come to accept your sexuality now, because if you don't, this is, you need to be yourself, because this is was difficult for her. They stayed together. They deeply needed each other. Yeah. They'd also became there were many tensions also. Mm-hmm.
Have you talked to Kelly O'Donnell at all about, so she's working on a project about doctors' wives and using a lot of their letters, and she's got some ones that sound a lot like that about the tensions, and she just might be a good person to talk to about how to incorporate and think about his wife as a part of this and use her documents, especially because I know some of them are sensitive and not cataloged, so probably haven't, it just might be a person to reach out to. She's done some really cool stuff with them.
Okay. Yeah.
Email me if you.
Yeah. Let me email you. What else was I going to say about that? I do think that it's more than just like, again, I really do think this is more than like pure curiosity. Like, I do think that a full understanding of his work actually demands exploring this. And in that later public writing, he quite explicitly asks for tolerance of homosexuality, right? Like, he, in Gluttons and Libertines, kind of summarizes the current kind of scientific and popular literature about these things, and then, as usual, brings in his own experience to a limited degree. He says things like, I've been to cocktail parties where everyone there was said to be gay, but you couldn't find a more kind of conventional, like, I forget his exact word, like, to his disappointment, right? Like, it ends up they were this is like high society. So he thinks that class differences are more important as a kind of cultural difference than he wouldn't kind of separate homosexuals as like a group. He notes there's a lot of diversity among them. And it ends up that I can gather from oral and other written sources that I can now understand what they mean, that he had many interactions with gay communities in different places. Mm-hmm. But I do not know that he was ever a member of a homophile organization. I don't have any record of that. Yeah. At the very least, I think it's important to recognize that, like, he was married. He had relationships with men. actually that was not an uncommon thing. The idea that one had to be not married or something is the key to this. No, this is there's no contradiction, or there were tensions among them, but it actually serves to highlight some aspects of like marriage as a social institution are much clearer when you see that they functioned really well together, and actually the gender relations were quite conventional in some ways. Yeah, so anyway. Go for it.
Well, first and foremost, I think I want to thank you for the presentation, because I kind of like the way you show a snippet of information in the primary document that you presented. But my main question is that at what stage of this project did you decide on the chapters of the book? Because looking at the chapters, it contains details information about what you are doing. So I'm just wondering that what stage were you, what information did you have that you decided that this is what the chapters of this project is going to be?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I realized that I had, you know what, I think everyone has the like time dilation problem of going through COVID. So I had seen most of the archival material, at least at a broad brush, and I was faced with not being able to see more, and I was trying to get a rough outline of what I could, and so that's when I began to outline. And I also realized that the project was so capacious that I would need to have a pretty clear guidelines for myself before I actually started to write chapters. Maybe I should have started writing chapters sooner. I mean, some people write as, like, in the archives, and I was bubbling over when I was doing those interviews, which were all very intense during the pandemic, and maybe I should have done more, like, formal writing than before having this sort of thing. I was writing notes to myself and all sorts of other free writing. But before I started writing chapters, I thought I needed at least abstracts of every planned chapter. And then I also wrote, thinking I would, for a book proposal, right? And then I also wrote more extended, like, synopses, like narratives. So I kind of thought about it as like an abstract that's like, what is this chapter doing and what's the bounds of it? And then I wrote usually like 3 to 5 paragraphs of like, what do I think is the narrative of each of these chapters? And then I for some time wrote like little source essays for myself, and then I grew weary of doing so for the latter chapters. But at that point I had 10 chapters, and the first few have had chapter mitosis occur. So essentially when I was well past most of the archival research, and I'm trying to remember whether I had just started interviewing or whether, it was after I had interviewed, because I could not see the structure. I was having real difficulty until I did those interviews. It was something. I was like, I'm either going to do this project or I'm not. And then I was like, I better know that I'm going to do it before I contact any relatives. And I was like, I think I'm going to do it. And then I contacted them, and then I really knew that I needed to do it. And it was after that I felt I could actually outline it. But the outline has expanded, but essentially is the same, like but divided up slightly differently. Because I realized I could not, like, Central America, sure, but really, like, the things that happen in Honduras and Guatemala are quite different, and things like that. Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you.